Near the southern bank of the Potomac River lies a field. It is silent, still, and covered in stones. But these stones do not belong here. They have each been carefully carved by human hands. They are all flat, rectangular with an arc at one end. They stand upright in steadfast defiance of gravity and in stark contrast to the crumbling ruins that surround them. This is Arlington National Cemetery, and it is the largest cemetery in the DC metro area. But not just anyone can be buried here. This cemetery is a monument to the men and women who have suffered, bled, and in many cases perished in defense of their nation. But before we can truly understand this place, we have to take a step back in time to unravel the fact behind the fallout. It is the early months of 1861. The United States has just been torn in two between those fighting to preserve the Union and those fighting to seek independence for the Confederacy. On the north bank of the Potomac River, Washington, D.C. serves as the capital of the United States. But on the south bank lies Arlington, a sprawling Virginia plantation constructed by George Washington Parke Custis, adoptive grandson to the first president of the United States. The property was inherited by his daughter Mary Custis and her husband Robert E. Lee. At the outbreak of hostilities, the federal government seized Arlington as collateral against taxes owed. This is technically illegal as Virginia no longer recognized federal authority, and Lee, as a citizen of Virginia, was presumably already paying taxes to Virginia and to the Confederacy. But with its proximity to the Union capital, there was no way to prevent it, and the land was occupied by Northern troops. Mary Lee tried to pay the taxes on her husband's behalf. Technically, the land was inherited by her rather than her husband in the first place. But the federal government refused the payment, insisting that only Lee himself as head of household could pay the taxes, and only in person, essentially forcing Lee to choose between serving his country or protecting his family's livelihood. Though modern historians are beginning to question just how much of a military genius Lee actually was, he was by no means an idiot. So he continued to fight as a Confederate general in the Civil War, rather than turning himself in as a traitor just so he could pay taxes on his wife's property. And so the war that would eventually claim 750,000 lives raged on, until cemeteries throughout the North could no longer handle the influx of casualties. The North desperately needed new cemeteries, and since Lee had not been foolish enough to turn himself in, the sprawling grounds of Arlington were prime real estate. The federal government selected Arlington as the site of a massive new cemetery specifically to hold the remains of Union soldiers, many of whom had died as a direct result of Lee's orders. The first bodies were strategically buried around Mary's rose garden so that it would be impossible for the Lees to ever live on the property again without being reminded daily of the cost of their treason. Though years after Lee's death, his family would sue the federal government and win for their refusal to accept Mary's tax payment and their unlawful seizure of the land, Arlington to this day remains a cemetery for America's fallen heroes. For the men and women who have served in the U.S. Armed Forces, there is no site more sacred than Arlington National Cemetery. Decorated war heroes, presidents of the United States, and the rank and file who gave their lives for their country, and in some cases their families, all find a permanent resting place in the rolling hills of Arlington. Though a veritable army of maintenance workers busy themselves to keep the property clean and well tended, the sound of tractors, lawnmowers, weed eaters, and the occasional sounds of guns firing, marking the burial of yet another service member, all seem to drift away, as squirrels, deer, and waterfowl lazily graze and meander among the tombstones and memorials. Words cannot describe, and simple pictures cannot convey the sheer scale of this place, and the seemingly infinite rows upon rows of gravestones standing for those who each suffered for their country in their own way. But now that I'm all choked up, let's see what Fallout 3 actually gets right about Arlington National Cemetery, and I wish I didn't have to say, but not a whole lot. The main issue with Arlington is its indescribable size. I walked until my feet were blistered and bleeding and my legs could no longer carry me, and I don't think I saw even half of the cemetery. The gravestones in Fallout 3 are far too large for the majority of stones, and while many higher-ranking and more recent residents do have fancier gravestones, the typical stone is actually rather narrow and they are stacked so close to one another that you can barely slip between the stones. The Arlington House, which appears as just another pre-war country home like those found in Minefield and Andale, is actually a magnificent pink marble plantation home that is visible for miles, surrounded by outbuildings, originally slave quarters. Many of the memorials throughout the cemetery are missing, like the famous Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and World War II Memorial. In all fairness, it looks like Bethesda did make a decent attempt to recreate the Women in War Memorial, which is the first thing many guests see as they approach the cemetery. I concede that the time it would take to properly design and populate a place such as Arlington Cemetery would be a colossal undertaking for the design and development team, especially for an area with relatively little to do. But the tiny size of the cell, generic copy and paste job used to create Arlington House, and all-around lack of attention to detail that was present in other famous locations in Fallout 3 just sort of stand as an almost intentionally lackadaisical effort on the part of Bethesda, either unwilling or unable to give Arlington the respect that is owed to every service member buried in Arlington National Cemetery. If you have stuck around this long, I would just like to say thank you. It didn't seem right to interrupt the video to ask for likes or to check out the other channel when dealing with a topic that is so near and dear to my heart, and having had the privilege to visit Arlington in person, I honestly cannot express the effect that it has had on me. If you would like to see more videos just like this, please let me know in the comments below. I was only in DC for 2 days and a lot of areas were undergoing construction and maintenance, so I wasn't able to visit or film every location that appears in-game. I am currently writing this script on a train to Boston, so you can probably guess I have other ideas for locations. I'm not going to close the video with my usual sign-off, and instead ask that you take some time to thank a friend or family member who has served in the military for the sacrifices they've made, no matter what they may be. Thank you, stay safe, and goodbye.